Susan Wingrove-Reed, and I'm the education consultant for the Anchorage Symphony Orchestra, as well as the principal keyboard player. And here we are already at the grand finale of our 22-23 season, and it's going to be a humdinger. So to start off with, we have a wonderful short piece by Anna Klein, who's one of the most in-demand young women living composers in the world today. She's a Grammy-nominated composer, has done a lot of collaborations with major orchestras, choreographers, visual artists, and filmmakers. She's been a composer since the age of 7. And the piece that we are going to do at the beginning of our concert, in lieu of an overture, was commissioned for the closing concert of the BBC Proms and conducted by the first female composer to ever conduct the prestigious closing night concert, Maren Alsop. A couple of interesting things about Anna Klein. During the pandemic, she entertained and amused and educated herself by studying the banjo, taking fiddle classes, drawing classes, a calligraphy class. She was living in Chicago at the time that she wrote Masquerade, which is our opening piece, and she studied the fiddle at the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago. There's a lush first theme in the piece and then a folk tune with lots of intense layers. And she said it's just like composing with a painting of sounds. She's had an extended residency with the Chicago Symphony, including school outreach. She wrote 6 orchestral pieces and an opera. And this year and next year, she is also a resident composer with the Helsinki Philharmonic and Trondheim Symphony, highly in demand. This piece was premiered, Masquerade, in 2013 at the Proms. And if you've never heard of the Proms before, it's an 8-week summer arts festival in London. And it's got a historical value of being the most democratic and largest music festival in the world. This piece, Masquerade, was inspired by 18th century concerts in splendid gardens in England. And it's a roller coaster of a musical ride that lasts 5 minutes. So it's an exuberant opener for a concert. One reviewer commented there's a section in it that's a little like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band nostalgia. The second theme is a real folk tune called The Juice of Barley, which goes back to the year 1695 in its first written collection. It's a dance and drinking song. And when Ms. Klein wrote the piece, she said using this tune gave her wonderful memories of her fiddle lessons. There's a fusion of music and dance that's in a lot of the underlying patterns of this music, a celebration of costumes and of people. And it's a noisily delightful appetizer to a concert. A program note by Larry Lapidus gave a wonderful summation. In this brief work, Klein evokes the hectic and sometimes lurid promenade festivals held in London during the 18th century, in which actors reciting Shakespeare vied with jugglers, fire eaters, and puppeteers to entertain masked revelers drawn from every level of English society. Klein catches her audience up in a dizzying swirl of activity in which every section of the orchestra calls for their personal attention in a joyous cacophony of cascading scales and snatches of melody. You're going to love this opener. After Klein's absolutely scintillating Masquerade, we're going to have one heck of a piano concerto, Tchaikovsky's First, one of the most famous concertos in the repertoire, played with great panache by my dear friend and wonderful pianist, Yulia Gorinman. The hypersensitive, insecure Tchaikovsky, well, his life was a procession of alternating peaks of elation and troughs of depression. And his life was a mess of contradictions. He was fond of bold musical gestures, yet he was unimpressed by Beethoven, Brahms, and Wagner. His confessed weakness was musical form, yet he idolized the music of Mozart. Tchaikovsky's is a passionate, ultra-romantic, unique voice in music. Filled with hummable tunes, his scores also include vibrant colors and gut-level emotion. He studied law, not music, early in his career and became a legal clerk in government service as a young adult. But there, according to Bach, Beethoven, and the Boys, Music History as It Ought to Be Taught by David W. Barber, there he perfected the art of looking busy while doing very little. He seriously started studying music at the age of 21, which in the music world is being a late bloomer. And he started at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he confessed to his professors that he didn't even know how many symphonies Beethoven had written. There's a story, whether it's true or not, it's still kind of fun to know, that he was terrified of conducting for fear that his head would fall off. So he would prop his head up with his left hand and conduct with his right when he was in front of an orchestra, which he rarely did. Tchaikovsky was also a music critic for 4 years for the Moscow Gazette while he was a student. And he referred to Wagner as boring, Bach as so-so, Handel as fourth-rate, and he shared reservations about Beethoven. He said that he liked Brahms personally, but hated his music. In 1877, it's a really interesting historical footnote that he got a letter from someone named Nadezhda von Meck. She was a widow, a rich widow, with 11 children, lots of money then, and so she offered to send a regular allowance to Tchaikovsky so he could spend his days composing. They never met. That was her one condition. And there were lots and lots of letters, which have been a feast for historians to study ever since. But it did give Tchaikovsky the independence to do what he loved to do. The amazing first piano concerto was written in 1874-75, but he heavily revised it in 1888, and that's the version that is usually played today. The iconic opening, a 4-note horn theme followed by crashing piano chords, has entered popular culture in so many ways, going back to Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater Radio, a 1971 cult film called Harold and Maude, Monty Python sketches, and much, much more. Nikolai Rubinstein was the director of the Moscow Conservatory and a renowned pianist. Tchaikovsky was not a pianist, by the way. And in 1874, at a Christmas Eve party, he had played a little bit of this newest concerto and hoping that Rubinstein would state that he was in love with it, and certainly he was expected to perform the premieres and first performances. But there was a torrent of criticism, Tchaikovsky recalled. Rubinstein referred to what he heard of the work as worthless and unplayable, so clumsy, so badly written as to be beyond rescue, the music vulgar. Only 2 to 3 pages are worth preserving. It's an extremely difficult piece, yes, and was revised a few years later with a few changes to the piano part. But that Rubinstein was so vitriolic on the initial hearing and refused to play it is a bit puzzling to historians. Tchaikovsky was 35 years old at the time that he wrote it. And Rubinstein was Tchaikovsky's boss at the conservatory. The pianist Hans von Bülow ended up playing the premiere in Boston, of all places, and he praised the originality, the nobility, strength. This true gem shall earn Tchaikovsky the gratitude of all pianists of all time, he enthused. Well, it has become incredibly popular. And it is interesting to note that Rubinstein later changed his mind and played it a few years to come and became a huge advocate for it. And according to annotator William Runyon, he therefore ate a substantial meal of crow. The revision in 1888 was done with the input of pianist Alexander Silotti. Yulia, my friend who will be playing this performance with us on stage, has been already posting on Facebook as she's exploring some excerpts from the piece and inviting everyone in Alaska to please attend or at least live stream. So I know it's going to be a very memorable performance. Yulia is Ukrainian and she is a personality that is larger than life. So cannot wait to hear her play this. I wanted to share just a little bit of an overview of the music itself. The concerto's passionate, emotional first movement showcases all the piano's capabilities, from upper register twinkling that seems to foreshadow the ballet, the Nutcracker, that he wrote a little later, to bass heavy growling and everything in between. The second movement bears a closer resemblance to Lyadov's Enchanted Lake, a dreamy, chromatic chapter that brings flute and cello solos forward before the piano urges a faster pace. The final movement pulses with energy and a huge nod to Russian folk tunes. The orchestra and pianists challenge each other throughout, building to an incredible unison peak at the glorious ending. Our music director, Elizabeth, chose to end our 22-23 season with Respighi's epic Pines of Rome. Respighi was a very important 20th century Italian composer. As a young man, he played the viola in a Russian orchestra for a few years after going away from Italy. And he studied orchestration with Rimsky-Korsakov, a master of tone color, for 3 years. When he got back home to Italy, he became a professor of composition, and with the designation of being quite modern, although later he was described more in a conservative vein. Interestingly, in 1932, he signed a manifesto with 9 other Italian composers condemning Stravinsky and Schoenberg and encouraging that Italian classical music go back into traditional lines. He was famous and rich at this point, by the way. His Fountains of Rome tone poem had brought him international fame, and then a few years later, the Pines of Rome, which we will be playing. He was the most famous Italian composer next to Puccini and his operas. Respighi was always fascinated with the distant past, and he has a reputation as being an over-the-top orchestrator, glorious colors of the instruments. He moved to Rome in 1913, and he resigned from his position as a composition teacher there in 1925 after he hit the international fame leagues monetarily and having his pieces performed internationally. In 1932, he had a heart attack and was confined to his bed, where he worked on the orchestration of his last work, a one-act opera, which was finished by his widow, who was a former student of his and a very fine singer. There was a huge state funeral, and now we regard him as a genius in the 20th century approach to harmony and orchestration, to human values in music and emotions, and his vivid tonal pictures. In the Pines of Rome, nature is a point of departure. Centuries-old trees that dominate the Roman landscape became witnesses to historical events over the centuries, umbrella-like pines, as they were described. There are 4 movements in the Pines of Rome, and each portrays the pines in different locations at different times of day. There is a huge orchestra necessary to perform the piece, the usual sections, strings, brass, and so on, but also the use of piano, celeste, offstage brass, and a bird, a recorded bird for the first time in musical history. It's a full workout for everyone in the orchestra. Interestingly enough, I found that he later wrote a piece in which he depicted snakes and spiders in a jungle research institute. And the name of this piece is Brazilian Impressions. So I highly recommend. The premiere of the Pines of Rome took place in an ancient mausoleum of the Emperor Augustus, which had been converted into a concert hall. His wife recalled that the last measures were drowned by frenetic applause as had never been heard before. He wrote a little description of the piece that I'd like to share with you now. The pines of the Villa Borghese. Children are at play in the pine groves, dancing the Italian equivalent of Ring Around a Rosie. They mimic marching soldiers and battles. They twitter and shriek like swallows at evening, coming and going in swarms. Suddenly, the scene changes. The pines near a catacomb. We see the shadows of the pines, which overhang the entrance of a catacomb. From the depths rises a chant, which echoes solemnly like a hymn and is then mysteriously silenced. The pines of the Janiculum, there is thrill in the air. The full moon reveals the profile of the pines of Gianacolo's hill, and a nightingale sings. The pines of the Appian Way, a misty dawn on the Appian Way. The tragic country is guarded by solitary pines. indistinctly, incessantly, the rhythm of unending steps. The poet has a fantastic vision of vast glories and past glories. Trumpets blare, and the army of the consul bursts forth in the grandeur of a newly risen sun toward the sacred way, mounting in triumph to the Capitoline Hill. The Pines of Rome is famous for being one of the first pieces to include electronics in its orchestration. However subversive this is in retrospect, it arrived in a very innocent fashion through the composer's instruction to play a recording of a nightingale at the end of the third movement. In the published score, Respighi specifically suggested that a 78 recording, an LP that had come out, be used. Later, that evolved into a cassette, which evolved into a CD. Well, whatever. It's a glorious anticipation of how electronic and taped sound would become fairly common in contemporary orchestrations. So, our closing night of the season: Anna Klein Masquerade, Tchaikovsky Concerto No. 1, and The Pines of Rome. Thank you so much for a wonderful season, and stay tuned for exciting news about next year's fantastical musical menu with your Anchorage Symphony Orchestra. Here's to all the music ahead, with all of us together in the Atwood Concert Hall.